They gave Clara Fenwick the ruined glasshouse because no one believed anything useful could grow there. Lady Octavia Price called it a kindness. "A little occupation of your own," she said, smiling over the rim of her teacup. "Somewhere out of the way, where you need not feel watched." What she meant was somewhere Clara could be forgotten. The glasshouse stood behind Merewick Hall, beyond the kitchen yard, and the clipped yew hedge where the formal garden gave up, and the land began to sink toward the marsh. Half the panes were cracked. 63 were missing altogether. Rain came through the roof in silver threads. Ivy had forced its way between the iron ribs, and the brick furnace beneath the north wall had not been lit in 12 years. It was not a room. It was the skeleton of one. Clara accepted the key with a quiet nod. For 4 years, since fever had taken both her parents and left her with £32, 2 mourning dresses, and no home of her own, she had lived at Merewick as a poor relation to the late Mrs. Harcourt. She had copied letters, mended household linen, sat through long nights with 6 servants, and corrected columns in the steward's accounts when the figures refused to meet. Her work appeared everywhere. Her name appeared nowhere. Lady Octavia, mother of the dead Mrs. Harcourt, had decided the arrangement was becoming awkward. Clara was too useful to dismiss and too poor to matter. So the glasshouse became a solution, a place where she might be occupied, a place where she might disappear. Clara turned the key in the rusted lock and stepped inside. Cold struck first, then damp, then the smell of wet brick, dead leaves, and old soil. But beneath it, faint as a pulse under skin, she caught something else, green. At the far end of the glasshouse, behind a curtain of thorn and mildew, an old fig tree had twisted itself through a broken planting bed. Most of its branches were gray. One had split under snow years ago. Yet near the wall where the last of the afternoon light gathered, 3 leaves remained. Clara crossed the room and pressed 2 fingers to the bark. It was not dead. The roots were still holding. She looked at the broken panes, the blocked furnace flues, the warped benches, and the copper pipes sunk beneath the brick floor. Lady Octavia had given her a ruin. Clara saw a machine. Her first week was spent uncovering it. She swept out 12 barrow loads of leaves. She pried ivy from the ironwork 1 careful length at a time. She found spare panes stacked behind the potting shed, clouded with grime but unbroken. She washed them in rainwater and fitted them where the wind cut hardest. The gardener, old Mr. Bell, had been reduced to trimming hedges since the estate stopped funding the kitchen garden. He watched her from the doorway on the 3rd morning. "You'll never heat it," he said. "Not all of it," Clara replied. He squinted at the blocked furnace. Flues cracked. Only after the 2nd bend. That made him look at her properly. Clara showed him the brick she had removed, then the soot line that proved where the leak began. Together, without discussing the change between them, they spent the afternoon opening the channel. The housekeeper, Mrs. Rusk, found them black with soot at dusk. She looked at Clara's torn glove, at the pile of broken mortar, and at the old gardener kneeling beside the furnace like a priest before an altar. "This is not suitable work for a lady," Mrs. Rusk said. "No," Clara agreed. "It is suitable work for whoever knows how to do it." Mrs. Rusk's mouth tightened. But the next morning a basket of old wool blankets appeared outside the glasshouse door to wrap the most vulnerable pipes. In the potting shed, Clara discovered 3 ledgers left by Merewick's last head gardener. They recorded furnace temperatures, seed dates, fruit yields, coal use, and market prices in a hand so disciplined that she trusted it immediately. She read them by candlelight. She learned where the heat used to travel, which beds held moisture, which wall caught enough winter sun to force lettuce, which varieties of pear had once paid for their own coal. Most important, she learned that the glasshouse had not failed. It had been abandoned. There was a difference. By the end of November, 1 section of roof was sound. The furnace warmed only the eastern bed, but it warmed it evenly. Clara moved the surviving fig tree's roots into fresh soil, wrapped the cracked trunk, and cut away every branch that could no longer carry life. Mr. Bell protested when she pruned it. "You'll kill what's left." "No," she said. "I'm removing what the roots can no longer afford." The words stayed with her after he left, what the roots could no longer afford. Merewick Hall was full of such things. Rooms kept open for guests who no longer came. Horses fed for a hunting season that had not been held since the mistress died. Silver polished every Thursday while tenant roofs leaked through autumn rain. A steward who ordered French pears for Lady Octavia and told the dairymaids there was no money for clean pails. The house was preserving its appearance while starving its foundations. Clara had lived that way herself, quietly, politely, at great cost. 6 weeks after Lady Octavia handed her the key, the old fig tree produced one fruit, only one. It hung beneath a broad leaf, purple-black and heavy, while frost silvered the outer glass. Clara stood before it for a long moment, then she laughed. The sound surprised her. It was small, rusty, almost unused. But it filled the glass house. That same evening, Edmund Harcourt left the drawing room because Lady Octavia had begun telling the story of her daughter's final winter again. He had heard every version. In some, Isabel had been brave. In others, saintly. In all of them, Edmund had failed to save her. 18 months of grief had reduced him to a tall, silent figure moving through his own estate as though he were waiting to be accused. He signed what the steward placed before him. He ate what appeared on the table. He allowed Lady Octavia to order the household because resistance required an energy he no longer possessed. Merewick's debts deepened. Its tenants waited. Its master slept badly and woke tired. That night he walked without direction until he saw light behind the yew hedge. Not candlelight, a warmer glow. Orange fire beneath green glass. He followed it. The door stood slightly open. Inside, the glass house breathed. Moisture clouded the panes. Pipes clicked softly beneath the brick floor. Rows of clay pots stood where broken benches had been. Winter cress greened one bed. Rosemary, sage, and lemon balm hung drying from a beam. At the center of it all stood Clara Fenwick. She had removed her gloves. Soul darkened the creases of her fingers. A pencil was tucked behind one ear and a ledger lay open beside a brass thermometer. She was looking at a fig. Edmund had seen figs in silver dishes all his life, imported, preserved, sugared, arranged. This one seemed different. It had grown here, in winter, in a room everyone had declared useless. Clara noticed him and straightened. Mr. Harcourt. He looked from her to the fruit. How? The root survived, she said. The glass did not. He stepped closer. There was no triumph in her voice, only fact. She took a small knife, cut the fig in half, and offered him one side. Edmund hesitated. Then he ate it. The flesh was warm from the glasshouse, dark red at the center, sweet without being cloying. It tasted of summer held against all reason in the middle of frost. For one sharp instant, grief loosened its grip. Not because the fig reminded him of Isabel. Because it did not. It belonged to the present. When did anyone last account for this place, he asked. Clara glanced at the ledger. The last complete record ends in 1881. And now there are 63 missing panes, 11 cracked furnace bricks, and enough sound piping to heat 1/3 of the eastern beds. The coal allocation is listed as 4 tons this quarter. I have received 1 ton and 600 weight. Edmund's head lifted. What did you say? She repeated it, calmly, precisely. The estate paid for 4 tons. Only 1 ton and 600 weight reached the glasshouse yard. Mr. Dallow's clerk signed the delivery book. Edmund stared at her. For 9 days he had been asking his steward why the coal bill had risen while half the house remained cold. The answers had been fog. Clara had just given him a number. How many tenant families requested seed potatoes this winter? 46. How many sacks remain? 11 sound sacks, 2 damp, 1 unusable. He took another step. And the dairy? 27 churns were invoiced last week. 19 arrived. 3 were watered. The pipes clicked beneath them. Outside, the wind pressed against the repaired panes. Inside, something in Edmund Harcourt's face changed. Not warmth, not yet. Attention. The next morning, Clara was summoned to his study. Edmund stood beside the window, dressed in black, one hand resting on a pile of unopened estate reports. Miss Fenwick, he said. Merewick is 6 months from failing to meet its spring obligations. Clara said nothing. The steward assures me otherwise. He is wrong. The directness of it seemed to strike the room. Edmund turned. You are certain? I am certain the household is spending as though appearances are assets. They are not. For the first time in months, the corner of his mouth almost moved. What would you do? Count what is real. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair opposite his desk. Sit. Clara sat. He pushed a blank ledger across the desk. You will oversee the glass house, kitchen gardens, dairy contracts, seed stores, and all market produce. You will have authority to inspect deliveries, reject inferior goods, and keep separate accounts. You will report to me every Saturday. Lady Octavia's face flashed in Clara's mind. Mr. Dallow's. The cold, smiling faces of people who would not forgive a poor relation for becoming difficult to ignore. Edmund continued. Your salary will be £18 a year with rooms and board. It was more money than Clara had possessed at one time in her life. Still, she did not answer immediately. Why me? Because you counted what was real. The room fell quiet. Clara looked at the blank ledger. For years she had survived by making herself small enough to fit inside other people's decisions. Now a door had opened. It was not safety, it was responsibility. She placed her hand on the ledger. Yes, Mr. Harcourt. Edmund gave one short nod. Good. Then let us find out what else in this house has been declared dead too soon. Clara began with weights, not rumors, not loyalties, not the polished explanations of men who had been paid to know better. Weights. Every sack that entered Merewick was weighed at the east gate. Every churn was measured. Every crate leaving the garden received a number, a destination, and a small crescent burned beneath the lowest slat where no buyer would notice it. Within 10 days the gaps appeared. Coal vanished between the railway siding and the furnace yard. Milk lost cream before it reached the kitchen. Seed grain arrived 2 stone lighter than the invoice claimed. Mr. Dallow, the steward, responded to each discovery with injured dignity. Country measures are never exact, Miss Fenwick. Then the invoice should not be exact either, Clara said. He smiled at her as one might smile at a child holding a wooden sword. You have spent very little time in business. Long enough to know that missing weight always belongs to someone. The smile left his face. Clara dismissed the dairyman who watered the milk. She replaced the coal carrier after finding Merewick's red thread seals on sacks delivered to a brickworks 3 miles away. She negotiated directly with 3 tenant farmers for winter roots and promised payment within 7 days. Not the 3 months Mr. Dallow considered customary. The first week the household complained, the second it resisted, by the third it began to work. The kitchen received deliveries it could plan around. The dairymaids were given scalding water and clean cloths. Mr. Bell hired 2 village boys to clear the west beds. Clara found that the old forcing frames could produce early spinach with half the coal listed in the 1881 ledger. She did not command through volume, she removed excuses. Menace were posted, stores were counted. Tools were repaired before they broke in a worker's hand. Mrs. Rusk watched from doorways, severe and silent. Then one wet morning Clara found a carpenter repairing the warped potting bench. I did not order this, she said. Mrs. Rusk, standing nearby with her ring of keys, examined the ceiling. No. I did. Their eyes met. It was not affection, it was recognition. The Saturday meetings in Edmund's study became the fixed point of both their weeks. Clara brought ledgers, Edmund brought questions. At first they spoke only of numbers. 14 pounds saved by changing the coal route. 9 pounds recovered from a false cream invoice. 7 acres of fallow kitchen land that could support tenant allotments without reducing rent yield. Then the conversations widened. Clara mentioned that the widow Ames had patched the same roof 3 times because the thatch allocation never arrived. Edmund sent men the next morning. Edmund asked why the western glasshouse bed remained empty. Clara explained that the soil there had been exhausted by years of forcing flowers for guests while never being restored. Can it recover? Yes, she said, but not by asking it for more. He looked at her then, more sharply than the question required. Some Saturdays he came to the glasshouse instead. He learned to recognize the smell of warm soil. He learned that Clara spoke to seedlings under her breath when she thought no one could hear. He learned that the ink stain on her right forefinger never vanished completely, no matter how hard she scrubbed. Clara learned that Edmund was not indifferent. He was ashamed that grief had become an excuse, ashamed that he had allowed other people to make decisions in his name, ashamed that tenants who had trusted the Harcourt family for generations had learned to expect nothing from him but silence. It would have been easier if he had been cruel. Cruelty was simple. Remorse required patience. By January, the glasshouse supplied cress, herbs, forced rhubarb, and enough early lettuce to reduce purchases from London. Clara began selling surplus bundles through a market woman in Netherby. The first payment was only £2, 11 shillings and 6 pence. She entered it in the ledger as though it were a royal grant. Edmund found her doing so. You are pleased, he said. The glasshouse has paid for 6 new panes. That pleases you? It means the 7th will not come from borrowed money. He studied her face. Then he smiled. It changed him so completely that Clara forgot for one dangerous second to look away. Merewick changed with the weather. Fires were lit in servants' rooms before frost settled inside the walls. Tenant children received boots purchased from savings in the dairy contract. The cook, who had not taken pride in a meal for 2 years, served a winter soup made entirely from estate produce, and waited outside the dining room to hear whether Edmund noticed. He did. He sent his compliments. The cook cried in the scullery and denied it afterward. The estate did not become wealthy. It became awake. And that was enough to frighten Cyrus Mordaunt. Mordaunt owned the brickworks beyond Netherby and most of the debt attached to the adjoining land. For 8 months he had been pressing Edmund to sell Merewick's South Meadow and the narrow mill stream that crossed it. Once he owned the water, his kilns could double production. A weakened estate might sell, a recovering one would not. Lady Octavia liked Mordaunt. He listened when she spoke of Isabel. He praised her taste. He agreed that Merewick had become vulgar since Clara Fenwick began discussing milk yields in rooms where ladies once discussed music. Mr. Dallow liked him for simpler reasons. Mordaunt paid in cash. Their first attack arrived through the village school. 32 children attended a winter supper funded by Merewick. The kitchen sent barley broth, bread, and 2 stone jars of milk punch made without spirits. Before midnight, 7 children were vomiting. By morning, 12 were ill. The rumor reached the hall before the doctor did. Miss Fenwick's milk was spoiled. Miss Fenwick had cut costs. Miss Fenwick had fed poor children what she would not serve upstairs. Lady Octavia repeated each version with sorrowful restraint. I warned Edmund that enthusiasm is not the same as judgment. Clara heard the whisper before she heard the facts. For one moment, fear emptied her mind, not fear for her position, fear that something under her authority had harmed a child. Then training returned. What did every sick child consume, she asked. Dr. Samuel Reed, who had come directly from the schoolhouse, removed his gloves. Bread, broth, milk punch. Did every child eat the broth? No. The bread? Yes. The milk, he paused. All 12. Clara turned to Mrs. Rusk. Bring the sealed sample jar from yesterday's dairy delivery. Lady Octavia stared. You keep samples? From every milk delivery. For 24 hours. Clara poured the milk into a shallow dish. A thin blue-white liquid spread across the china, no cream line. She smelled it. Then she touched one finger to the rim and tasted the smallest possible amount. Edmund stepped forward. Clara, chalk, she said, and something bitter. Dr. Reed bent over the dish. Borax, perhaps. The replacement dairyman had not merely watered the milk. He had treated it to hide sourness. Mr. Dallow had approved him 2 days earlier. Clara opened her ledger. The broth was cooked at Merewick. The bread was baked here. The milk came from Pratt's yard under a contract signed by Mr. Dallow. There are 4 unopened churns from the same morning. Dr. Reed's expression hardened. Then we have our source. By noon, the churns were seized. By evening, Pratt had admitted that Dallow's clerk promised the sour milk would be accepted without inspection. But rumors do not die because facts arrive. They only change shape. Now Clara was called ambitious, unwomanly, dangerous. At church, 2 ladies turned their shoulders when she passed. At the grocer's, conversation stopped. Clara bore it. What she had not expected was Edmund's fury. He dismissed Pratt's contract publicly. He ordered the school physician's costs paid. Then he wrote to every household that had received Merewick milk and signed the letter himself. No excuses, no concealment. The next Saturday, he stood in the Glasshouse while Clara checked a row of seedlings. You should have told me they were speaking against you, he said. You knew. I knew there were whispers. I did not know they were making you responsible for my steward's contract. Clara pressed soil around a young plant. Whispers cannot be entered in a ledger. No, but harm can. She looked up. Edmund's hands were clenched at his sides. The anger in him was not the helpless rage of grief. It had direction now. Why does it matter so much to you? She asked before caution could stop her. His answer came without preparation. Because I know what it is to be judged by the worst thing that happened under your roof. The Glasshouse went still. Clara saw then that Lady Octavia's stories had not merely preserved Isabel. They had sentenced Edmund. Every retelling suggested that a better husband, a more attentive man, a stronger man, might have defeated illness itself. Clara wiped soil from her fingers. Her death was not proof against you. His face tightened. You cannot know that. No, she said. But I know grief is not an account that balances because someone accepts all the blame. He looked at her for a long time. Then his gaze dropped to the young plants between them. Can those survive the cold? If the roots take, and if the glass breaks, we repair it. The words were plain. The silence after them was not. That night, Edmund returned to his study and removed Isabel's portrait from above the fireplace. He did not hide it. He placed it on the opposite wall, still present, no longer presiding. Lady Octavia noticed before breakfast. The war became open after that. The forged letter was found in Clara's locked desk on a Tuesday morning. It bore Edmund's estate seal. It authorized the sale of 80 mature oaks from Merewick's Eastern Grove to a timber agent in York. The price was £600. £60 had supposedly been paid in advance. The money was missing. The Eastern Grove had been planted by Edmund's grandfather. Isabel had walked there every spring. Selling it without the master's permission would have been theft, fraud, and an act of calculated cruelty. Lady Octavia made certain the accusation was not private. She summoned Edmund, Mrs. Rusk, Mr. Dallow, 2 footmen, and Cyrus Mordaunt to the morning room, where Clara stood beside the open desk. The letter lay on green velvet as though it were a body. Mr. Dallow spoke first. "I regret to say the agent confirms he met with Miss Fenwick." "I have never met him," Clara said. "He describes you exactly. Plain dress, brown hair, a woman alone, an exact description indeed." Mordaunt lowered his eyes to hide a smile. Lady Octavia did not bother. "You were given authority," she said, "and this is what you did with it." Clara looked at Edmund. He had gone very pale. Not because he believed the letter, because the seal was his. The imprint was unmistakable, the Harcourt stag, the chipped point on the left antler, a private mark kept in a locked drawer in his study. Evidence had been designed to touch every wound at once: the estate, his dead wife, his own trust. Lady Octavia leaned closer to him. "You mistook obedience for character, Edmund. It is not too late to correct the error." The room held its breath. Clara could feel her pulse in her hands. She had faced hunger, death, dependence, the daily humiliation of being useful only when invisible. But this was different. She had built something, now she could lose it in a minute. Edmund picked up the forged letter. He read it once, then again. His eyes moved to the wax, the signature, the date. Finally he looked at Clara. "Did you authorize this sale?" "No." "Did you receive £60?" "No." "Did you place this letter in your desk?" "No." Her voice did not shake. Edmund turned to Dallow. "When was the Eastern Grove inspected?" "Last Thursday." "By whom?" "My clerk and the agent." "Before or after the date on this letter?" Dallow hesitated. "After." Edmund's gaze sharpened. "The letter authorizes cutting to begin on Monday, yet the agent inspected on Thursday. A preliminary visit, perhaps. Then why is it not recorded?" Dallow's face changed by a fraction. Edmund saw it. So did Clara. Lady Octavia stepped in. "This is evasion. The document was in her desk." Edmund folded the letter. "Paper can be placed anywhere. Your seal cannot." "No," he said, "but wax can remember an impression." Mordaunt's smile vanished. Edmund crossed the room and stopped in front of Clara. He did not speak softly this time. He spoke so everyone could hear. "Miss Fenwick has accounted for every shilling under her authority. Until evidence proves otherwise, she retains that authority." Lady Octavia stared at him. "You believe her over your own seal. I believe a year of work over a piece of wax." Clara's breath caught. Edmund turned to Mrs. Rusk. "Change every lock connected to the estate offices. No one enters my study or Miss Fenwick's workroom without written permission." Then to Dallow. "You will surrender your keys." The steward's face drained. "Sir, this is an insult. It is an instruction." Dallow placed the keys on the table. Mordaunt moved toward the door. Edmund stopped him. "You will remain available until I understand why your timber agent inspected trees he had no legal right to purchase." Mordaunt's expression hardened. "You are allowing a dependent woman to ruin your judgment." "No," Edmund said. "I am allowing facts to ruin yours." The confrontation ended there. The danger did not. That evening Clara packed her small trunk, not because Edmund had dismissed her, because he had not. She understood what his trust would cost him. Mordaunt held notes against the estate. Lady Octavia controlled the story of Isabel's death in every respectable drawing room in the county. Dallow knew the habits of the house. Clara had become the point where all their pressure met. She folded her 2 good dresses, wrapped her mother's comb in linen, and placed the blank ledger Edmund had first given her on top. A knock came. Edmund entered before she could hide what she was doing. His gaze moved from the trunk to the folded clothes. "No," Clara straightened. "You do not know what I was going to say." "Yes, I do, Mr. Harcourt." "No." The force in the word startled both of them. He closed the door. "You will not leave because they forged a letter. They will not stop. Neither will I. Mordaunt can call in the spring note. I know. Lady Octavia can turn every family in the county against you. She has been practicing for 18 months. And if they destroy Merewick to reach me?" Edmund came closer. "They were destroying Merewick before you touched a single pane of that glass house." Clara looked away. Her composure began to fray at the edges. "I know how to survive being unwanted," she said. "I do not know how to survive being the reason someone else loses everything." Edmund's voice lowered. "You're not the reason." She shook her head. He stepped between her and the trunk. "Look at me." She did. There was no grief mask now, no distant courtesy. Only a man fully present inside his own life. "You counted what was real," he said. "So count this. The dairy is honest. The school children are recovering. 46 families have seed potatoes. The South Meadow is not sold. The Eastern Grove is still standing. And I have begun making decisions in my own house again." His eyes held hers. "That is what your presence has done." Clara could not answer. Edmund reached toward her hand, then stopped before touching it. The restraint was more intimate than contact. "If you ever leave Merewick," he said, "it will be because you choose a life elsewhere, not because a liar frightened you out of this one." He turned and left. Clara stood beside the open trunk for a long time. Then she unpacked it. The proof came from heat. 3 days after the forged letter was found, the Glasshouse furnace failed before dawn. Clara and Mr. Bell opened the ash chamber and discovered coal unlike the estate's usual supply. It burned too hot, left a red clinker, and carried a fine orange dust. Mr. Bell spat into the ash. "Brickworks coal." Cyrus Mordaunt's kilns used the same low-grade seam. Clara stared at the furnace, then at the delivery ledger. The estate had paid for Welsh steam coal for 7 months. If Brickworks coal had been substituted here, where had the better coal gone? She sent one of the village boys to the railway siding with 6pence and a request to copy the wagon numbers chalked on Merewick deliveries. She compared them with Mr. Dallow's invoices. The numbers did not match. She checked the crate book next. 118 boxes of early greens and winter herbs had been marked spoiled in Dallow's central accounts. Yet Clara's own book showed them leaving the east gate in good condition. Each carried the crescent burned beneath the lowest slat, a mark no one else knew existed. Clara went to Edmund. He read the figures in silence. "How much?" "Coal, produce, and dairy contracts together. At least £900 over 18 months, perhaps more. Enough to force a land sale. Enough to make Mordaunt's offer seem like rescue." Edmund sat back. "And the forged timber letter. A way to remove me before I found the rest. Can we prove where the goods went?" "Not from paper." She met his eyes. "But crates leave tracks." The annual Candlemas market was 6 days away. For generations, Merewick had opened its lower hall to tenants, merchants, lenders, and neighboring estates at the end of winter. Contracts were renewed. Debts settled. Seed bought. Labor promised for spring. Edmund had cancelled it the previous year. This year he sent invitations. Mordaunt accepted immediately. He believed the estate was desperate. He believed Clara was cornered. He believed the forged letter had failed only because Edmund was emotionally compromised. Most dangerous of all, he believed a woman who worked in soil would not understand how men moved money. For 6 days, Clara did not sleep more than 4 hours at a time. Mrs. Rusk organized the household. Mr. Bell sent messages through market gardeners. Dr. Reed spoke to the magistrate. Edmund rode to York and returned after midnight with mud to his knees and a leather case chained to his wrist. No one in the house discussed what would happen if they failed. The answer was too clear. Mordaunt would call the note. Merewick would sell the South Meadow. Dallow would leave with a reference. Lady Octavia would say she had warned them. And Clara would once again become a woman whose truth could not outweigh a gentleman's signature. On Candlemas morning the lower hall filled before 10. Tenant farmers stood beside merchants in clean coats. Kitchen maids watched from the gallery. The bank's representative sat near the front with a gray folder on his knee. Lady Octavia wore black silk and the expression of a widow attending a funeral she had arranged herself. Cyrus Mordaunt arrived late. He wanted the room to notice him. Mr. Dallow came beside him. Edmund stood at the long table beneath the Harcourt crest. Clara stood at his right, not behind him. At his right, Mordaunt noticed. His smile sharpened. "Shall we begin?" he said. The first hour passed in ordinary business, seed contracts, grazing rights, repairs to the marsh road. Then the bank representative opened the gray folder. "Merewick's spring note becomes payable in 41 days, he said. "Mr. Mordaunt has offered to purchase the South Meadow and Millstream for £1,200, which would satisfy the immediate obligation." A murmur moved through the hall. £1,200 sounded large to men who earned 30 in a year. It was less than half the land's value. Edmund remained standing. "And if I decline, the bank must consider other remedies." Mordaunt spread his hands. "No one wants that. My offer preserves the house. Clara looked at him. No, it preserves the house long enough to empty it. The room went quiet. Mordaunt smiled. Miss Fenwick has strong opinions for an employee. She also has records, Edmund said. Dallow stepped forward. So do I. He placed 3 ledgers on the table. These are the estate accounts for the past 18 months. They show severe losses under Miss Fenwick's management. Spoiled produce, excess fuel, unrecoverable tenant credit. Her glasshouse may be picturesque, but it has cost Merewick dearly. Lady Octavia closed her eyes as though in pain. Clara opened the first ledger. She recognized the handwriting, not Dallow's, his clerk's. The figures were clean. The theft was hidden in categories no casual reader would question. Waste, breakage, weather damage, charity. Mordaunt turned toward the crowd. This estate needs discipline, not experiments. Clara closed the ledger. You are right about one thing. His smile returned. There has been waste. She nodded to Mrs. Rusk. The side doors opened. 4 garden workers rolled in a wagon stacked with wooden crates. Mud stained the boards. Some were broken. Others still carried fragments of London market labels. Clara lifted the nearest crate and turned it over. Beneath the lowest slat was a small burned crescent. The central accounts list 118 crates from Merewick's Glasshouse as spoiled. She pointed to the wagon. These were sold through Fenner and Mordaunt Produce, Bishopsgate. The bank representative leaned forward. Mordaunt did not move. Clara held up a bundle of receipts. The London broker provided sales records after Mr. Harcourt served him with notice. The goods earned £387. None of it entered Merewick's accounts. Dallow's face went white. Mordaunt recovered first. Crates are reused. Yes, Clara said, which is why the burn mark is beneath a slat joined with Merewick's 3-nail pattern. Mr. Bell made everyone. Old Mr. Bell stood in the crowd. Aye, he said, and I can name the tree the boards came from. A ripple of laughter broke the tension. Mordaunt snapped. This proves nothing about me. Edmund opened the leather case. Then perhaps the railway records will. He placed a sheaf of copied freight manifests on the table. 7 wagons billed to Merewick were redirected to Mordaunt Brickworks. The wagon numbers match Miss Fenwick's independent notes from the siding. The coal purchased with Merewick funds heated your kilns. The bank representative removed his spectacles. Dallow backed 1 step away. Clara opened a small cloth packet and poured red clinker onto a white plate. This was taken from the Glasshouse furnace. Brickworks coal. Inferior, hotter, and unsuitable for the old flues. The Welsh coal we paid for never reached us. Mordaunt's composure cracked. You expect sensible men to accept kitchen ash as evidence. Dr. Reed rose from the second row. No, but the county analyst may accept it. He has samples from both furnaces. The magistrate stood beside him. And I have sworn statements from the railway porter and Mr. Mordaunt's broker. The crowd shifted. Not away from Clara, toward Mordaunt. Dallow's eyes moved to the door. Mrs. Rusk stepped into his path. Not yet. Her voice carried like a bell. She held up a small disc of dark wax. I found this pressed inside the lining of Mr. Dallow's dispatch box when his office keys were surrendered. Edmund's face went still. The Harcourt stag, the chipped left antler, a perfect reverse impression of his seal. Lady Octavia whispered. No. Mrs. Rusk looked at her. I also found a note in your hand instructing him to place the timber letter where Miss Fenwick kept her private accounts. The hall erupted. Lady Octavia stood so quickly her chair fell backward. I instructed no such thing. Mrs. Rusk unfolded the paper. You wrote that Mr. Harcourt required a shock strong enough to restore his reason. Edmund's expression did not change. That was worse than anger. Mordaunt turned on Dallow. You fool. The word broke the last protection between them. Dallow pointed at him. It was your scheme. You said the sale would cover everything. The crowd roared. The magistrate called for silence. No one obeyed. Tenant men shouted about missing coal. Dairy women shouted about watered milk. The schoolmaster demanded to know who would answer for the sick children. Through it all, Clara stood with one hand resting on the marked crate. Not triumphant, steady. The proof did not need her emotion. It had weight. It had wagon numbers, it had ash, it had receipts. It had traveled through the same gates the thieves believed no one was watching. Mordaunt was charged with fraud and conspiracy before sunset. Dallow was taken from Merewick in the magistrate's carriage. Lady Octavia was not arrested. Her punishment was quieter. Edmund asked her to leave the house before nightfall. She stood in the great hall beneath her daughter's portrait, surrounded by trunks. You are choosing that woman over Isabel. Edmund looked up at the portrait. No, His voice was calm. "I am choosing the living over the use you have made of the dead." Lady Octavia's face collapsed. For the first time, she had no story ready. She left without saying Clara's name. The bank did not call the note. The recovered funds, combined with the London sales, covered the spring obligation. More important, the evidence voided Mordaunt's claim over the South Meadow. Merewick remained intact, but the true victory did not come from keeping land. It came 3 mornings later when 46 tenant families arrived at the East Yard for seed distribution and found every sack present, dry, weighed, and labeled. No speeches, no applause, just proof that spring would begin on time. Clara watched from the Glasshouse door. Edmund came to stand beside her. For several minutes neither spoke. The old fig tree had begun to leaf again. Its branches were still uneven. The trunk still carried the scar where winter had split it. Clara had not hidden the damage. She had built around it. "You were right," Edmund said. "About what?" "The roots." She glanced at him. He was not looking at the tree. He was looking at her. That evening, rain turned to snow. Clara remained in the glass house after the workers left, checking the furnace draft. The warm section glowed against the dark garden. Moisture purled on the repaired panes. Beneath the benches, pipes ticked with steady heat. Edmund entered carrying 2 ledgers. Clara smiled faintly. "If those are more railway records, I refuse to read them tonight." "They are not." He placed them on the bench. One was the estate ledger. The other was a new book bound in green leather. He opened it. The first page read, "Merewick Garden and Produce Company Partners, Edmund Harcourt and Clara Fenwick." Clara stared. "This is not proper." "No," he said. "It is legal. You cannot make me a partner because I exposed a theft. I am not. Because I saved the spring note? No." "Then why?" Edmund took off his gloves. For a man who had faced creditors, scandal, and a crowded hall without trembling, he now seemed uncertain what to do with his hands. "Because every decision worth making in this house has become clearer when you are in the room." Clara did not move. He continued. "I have spent 18 months living as though loyalty to the past required refusing the future. You never asked me to forget Isabel. You asked me to count what was real." His voice roughened. "What is real is that I trust you. I admire you. I look for you when I enter a room. And when I imagine Merewick 10 years from now, you are already there." The furnace gave a low sigh. Snow tapped softly against the roof. Edmund reached for her hand. This time he did not stop. His fingers closed around hers, soil-ruined palm against ink-stained skin. "I want you as my partner in the estate," he said. "But that is not all I am asking." Clara's breath became unsteady. He did not kneel. He stood before her as an equal, with nothing hidden behind ceremony. "Marry me." The words were simple, so was her answer. "Yes." His eyes closed for 1 second as though relief itself had weight. Clara laughed then. Not the startled, rusty sound that had escaped her over the first winter fig. A full laugh, warm enough to fill every broken corner of the glass house. Edmund bent his forehead to hers. Outside, snow covered the abandoned beds. Inside, roots held fast beneath warm earth. 1 year later, Merewick entered winter without fear. The South Meadow remained pasture. The mill stream powered a repaired grain mill owned jointly by the estate and its tenants. The dairy contract paid the women who did the work instead of the middleman who once diluted it. The glass house had every pane. Clara refused to make it elegant. She kept the old iron ribs, the scarred brick, and one section of mismatched glass where the first repairs had been made from whatever she could find. "It reminds us what held," she told visitors. The Merewick Garden and Produce Company sold forced greens, herbs, figs, preserves, and seed stock to 3 towns. Its first full year earned enough to clear the oldest tenant repair debt and establish a small school where village girls learned accounts, weights, contracts, and horticulture. Lady Octavia would have called it unsuitable. Clara called it useful. Mrs. Rusk ran the household with the satisfaction of a general whose army had finally been given boots. Mr. Bell trained 2 apprentices and complained daily that young people had no respect for pruning. Dr. Reed continued to arrive uninvited whenever the glass house produced figs. Edmund learned to test soil moisture with his finger. He remained terrible at tying climbing vines. Clara married him in the village church in May, with tenants filling the pews and glasshouse workers standing at the back in clean coats. There were no diamonds. She wore her mother's comb and carried a branch from the old fig tree. By the next winter, that tree held 12 fruits. On the coldest evening of the year, Clara and Edmund stood beneath it while snow whitened the dark garden beyond the panes. The estate ledger lay open on the bench. Balanced. The spring seat order was paid. The furnace held a steady temperature. Edmund touched the scar in the fig tree's trunk. Do you ever think about the day they gave you this place? Yes. Were you angry? Clara considered at first, and then, I realized they had mistaken neglect for emptiness. He smiled. That sounds like you. No, she said, looking around the warm glass house. It sounds like Merewick. He took her hand. Beyond the repaired roof, snow fell in silence. Inside, every living thing rested on roots no one could see. The glass house had been meant to make Clara disappear. Instead, it became the room where every hidden thing came to light.